Merry Christmas, everyone. This is the December 25th edition of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry, coming to you in video form here at thecardinalnation.com and audio via the Scoops Sports Network and all your favorite podcast apps. Merry Christmas to you and your family, Blake.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you as well, Brian.
So before we get into the next prospects in our top 50 countdown that we've unveiled over the last week or so, wanted to touch briefly on some announcements the Cardinals made on Monday. As folks remember, Cardinals are, revamping their player development organization, and in October they announced a new assistant general manager of player development performance. That's Rob Cerfolio from the Indians. And then about a month later, a little over a month later, at the beginning of December, the Cardinals announced 3 director level positions that report to Cerfolio, and they're the director of player development or farm director, the performance director, and pitching director. So now on Monday, they went down one more level and said, okay, reporting to these director level positions are coordinators. And they announced 4 coordinators, a pitching coordinator, a field coordinator, an assistant field coordinator / base running coordinator, and a catching coordinator. What's missing there is a hitting coordinator. And the assumption is that Russ Steinhorn, who's had that job for the last several years, is going to remain. It looks like probably these 3 of the new coordinators will be reporting to the farm director, with one of them the director of pitching, who would report to Matt Pierpont, who is the director, and that director of that coordinator, pitching coordinator, is Austin Maine, who's a St. Louis native, came from the Orioles. Have you heard anything about him?
I haven't heard a ton about Maine, and I haven't had a chance to really look it up, but to the best of my knowledge, he's regarded as pretty actually well regarded as kind of a bright young pitching mind specifically. And I think that's one of the things we've seen the Cardinals start to target, especially when we look at pitching, is youth a little bit. And it seems like he's somebody who's going to be a guy who has more of an intuitive understanding of pitch shapes and pitch metrics, and really how he can kind of work with pitchers to kind of overcome some of their weaknesses, add to their arsenal, subtract from the arsenal, kind of revamp when they're throwing certain pitches and things like that. So very curious to see what he can bring to the organization.
Yeah, it's interesting, bringing in all these new faces, even though they're from other organizations, they're definitely going to be all pulling in the same direction with the direction that comes down from Keim Bloom and Cerfolio. The assistant field coordinator and base running coordinator is a guy that we've know pretty well as a manager of the Springfield Cardinals the last few years, and was a Texas League Manager of the Year, and that's Jose Lajer. And Jose Lajer, like I said, will be both the assistant field coordinator as well as a base running coordinator. And the Cardinals have had roving instructors that have worked with players on base running in the past, but making that a formal title suggests the Cardinals are going to put more importance on base running than they did before. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely think that that's kind of the big takeaway from this. And I also think it's interesting for Lajer. To my knowledge, he's been pretty well regarded in the organization, and I would assume this would be considered a promotion for a minor league manager, but it could potentially put him on a different track if he wants to kind of stay in the front office on more of a player development side, or more of like an organization-wide kind of side, or if he wants to start trying to push his way up to the major league staff.
And Lajer in the past was in charge of the Dominican Academy. So, he's kind of worked on both sides in terms of, when he was in the Dominican, he was in charge of really all aspects other than managing the DSL Cardinals. And as you said, the last, 4 or 5 years, he's been a manager. So now he's getting more back into, more hands-on player development, and will likely be moving around the system.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also interesting that he's been a guy who has actual managerial experience at the highest level of winter ball leagues in the Dominican. So definitely a guy who's seen a lot of things and feels like he should be pretty good in that role.
Yeah, probably an up and coming guy to watch for moving up to a major league organization in some more major league team in some role in the future. Another coordinator the Cardinals added is a catching coordinator, and this is a gentleman named Ethan Goforth. And again, the Cardinals haven't had a catching coordinator for at least 10 years since Dan Billardello left. And even when Billardello was there, he was a minor league manager as well. So again, the Cardinals, they had Brian Eversgard be a roaming catching guy for a year, but that was just a passing thing. The Cardinals haven't had anybody, didn't have anybody in the catching coordinator job this last year either. So, it's a really, again, a new focus, putting a person in that role whose job is developing catching in the system, which is, by the way, one of the positions that's most bountiful in the system right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, it feels like the Cardinals are already pretty good at catching development. So it's fun to see them actually add a guy who's basically his title is essentially developer of catchers. And it's also cool that it's a guy who was a catcher and was drafted and played minor league baseball not that long ago. I mean, it looks like the latest stats I can find for him are 2021. So only a couple years removed from his playing career. So it definitely seems like maybe something of an up and comer, but also a guy who's played the position and at a high level and should know the intricacies of it.
That's right. That's right. And then maybe arguably the most important role here, you could argue certainly pitching coordinator is pretty important too, but the minor league field coordinator, a gentleman named Ryan Barba. And most interesting, his last stop was on Mike Shilt's staff of the San Diego Padres this last year as what they called major league field coordinator. And I'm not really sure what that responsibility is on a major league team, but I can tell you his role as minor league field coordinator, he's basically going to be charged with everything from running spring camps to, working with which players move up. The field coordinator is a pretty important job, but it's a job that the Cardinals haven't had anybody filling since 2020, the 2020 season. At that time, Chris Swager left the organization, and they really didn't fill the job. Different people have sort of had parts of that responsibility. Jose Oquendo's been coordinator of instruction, and likely he'll stay on. But that was really coordinating the teaching aspects, whereas the minor league field coordinator is a more encompassing job.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I don't know a ton about this guy, but I think just like as a whole, it's really good to see the Cardinals investing in some of this player development infrastructure and really putting guys who seem to be knowledgeable in a place where they can actually help these players get the most out of their careers and thus help the Cardinals get the most potential value out of them going forward, which should be huge for them.
Yep,
Hopefully,
three of these individuals are new to the organization. Of course, Lahare is returning. And again, one job is brand new. Another job's been open for basically the last decade. One job's been open since 2021. And the other one, pitching coordinator, of course, has been filled throughout. So a lot of changes and a lot more coming. I would imagine they still haven't announced the next level of people down and all the staff people and the managers, the coaches in the system. So, the Cardinals have been methodically going through this process to identify these individuals and get them hired.
yeah, great to see it. And they snuck it in right before that, soft Christmas deadline. I'm sure this was worked out well in advance, but great timing to put it 2 days before Christmas and get it handled.
Yeah, and they, like I said, we know for sure they're going to have one minor league manager job to fill in Springfield, and probably some other positions will change as well. So they need to get busy getting that all done because let's face it, players will be reporting to Jupiter in less than 2 months. So
That's true.
all right, so let's switch gears now and talk about the Cardinal Nation top 50 prospect list for 2025. Last week we covered down to about 15 or 16, 17, something like that. And we're going to pick it up and cover the last 8 or 10 players that have come off the board since. At number 16 is right-handed reliever Zack Showalter. And folks may remember that he came over from the Baltimore organization last year. He was only 19 at the time, so he pitched his age 20 season in Palm Beach this year. When he was healthy, he was exceptional. And Showalter was, in fact, named a Florida State League All-Star, despite the fact he only got into 24 games this year. But when he did, 15.5 strikeouts per 9, that gets your attention.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I mean, he's a guy who throws a ton of fastballs, and his fastball is electric. It's not thrown that hard, but the shape of it is just astronomically good. And hitters don't know what to do with it. It comes from a super low release height, gets a lot of riding life from that release height. And it just, because it comes from such a low height, it really has that rising effect on hitters. It really struggles. They just really struggle to see it and to make contact with it. So on the season, it actually had a 40% whiff rate, which is crazy high for a fastball. And when that pitch is thrown in the upper third of the zone or higher, that whiff rate goes up to 55%. That's a borderline unhittable fastball. So obviously, we're looking at him in 1 inning stints, He's still young. He's facing hitters that are less advanced than single A, but that is absolutely a pitch that can form the base of his arsenal and be a true bat missing pitch going forward. And then he's also got a good breaking ball, which can get a little slurvy. It's probably some combination of a slider and a curveball. So I'd like to see him maybe just flatten it out, turn it into a true sweeper, and get away from some of the inconsistencies there. And the developing changeup that also looks really good. So I mean, he's got a really solid three pitch mix, but again, he's still a long way from the majors. He's a guy who hasn't thrown a ton of innings. I think he projects as a starter, but obviously that's if he can stay healthy and put the innings on his arm. Even if he can't, he looks like an impact arm if he can stay healthy and actually, get those innings on his arm and push towards the major leagues.
And Blake, of course, is talking about Zack Showalter, our number 16 prospect. At number 15 is a guy who's been in the system. Folks are familiar with him because he came from the University of Missouri back in that 2020 draft that, of course, brought Walker and Wynn and Burleson. But then we've got Ian Bedell, as well as Tank Hens, who we'll, of course, talk about later in this prospect list, not this week. Ian Bedell, who this year started the season in Springfield, worked his way up to Memphis primarily due to injuries, kind of had an up and down year, had a little injury at the end of the year, was available in the Rule 5 draft, wasn't taken, but that maybe wasn't surprising because while Bedell has reached AAA, he's got some more work to do before he can get to the majors.
Yeah, he does. He's a really kind of interesting and almost weird pitcher at times because his fastball is really more horizontally inclined than it is vertically. It's not really a pitch that rises. It's got some sinking life to it, but he gets like 14 inches of arm side run on his four seamer, which is typically a profile you would see out of a sinker, but it is a true four seam from him. So a little bit of an interesting pitch. It got hit around a little bit in AAA, but it's not necessarily a terrible pitch. But we'll see how it plays with the horizontal profile. I think it's something that he can really lean into, and I think that's one of his strengths actually is his ability to throw arm side moving pitches. And you see that sometimes with pitchers, they have certain biases towards the way they grip a ball and things like that. And it really looks like Bedell has what's called a pronation bias. So he throws a fastball that runs a lot. He throws a changeup that runs a lot, but he really struggles to get good glove side break on his pitches. So he'll mix in a slider and a cutter. He'll oftentimes really struggle to get that over into glove side break territory as opposed to arm side break territory. He's kind of dropped the curveball. So, I think there's a lot to work with there from a fastball and a changeup perspective. But when we're actually looking at the breaking balls or anything that's really moving to his glove side, there's still some development to be had.
So we talked about Ian Bedell. The guy next at number 14 is a guy that Bedell may be competing with for a spot in the Memphis rotation come spring. And I'm talking about Gordon Graceffo, who, had such a dynamite season 2 years ago. Last year, struggled with some shoulder issues, as I believe it was back in Memphis this year, got off to a pretty good start, had an ERA under 4, strikeout per inning with Memphis, got called up and made his debut in long relief, did a nice job with St. Louis, but then, went back down to Memphis and really didn't do as well in the last half of the season. What should we be thinking and expecting from Gordon Graceffo going forward? Is he going to be a starter in the majors?
I think it's really hard to predict because I think a lot of it depends on just how dynamic his fastball can be. We've seen him sitting mid 90s in starts. We've seen him get his fastball up to 99. It's just not there anymore. It averaged 94 miles per hour last year. It was down to 92 and a half on average this year. So it's, kind of started out low, spiked, and it's come back down. And the shape of the pitch really isn't that good. So it's really a pitch that's reliant on its velocity. So it's not that effective at 92. It's much more effective when it's sitting like 95, 96. So I think a lot of his effectiveness is really going to come down to can he find that lost velocity? And if he can't, and if he moves to the bullpen, he's a guy with 3 good secondaries whose fastball velocity is going to tick up. So I do think he's a legitimate major league arm. It's just a question of if he can get enough juice out of that fastball to be more of that like back end and mid rotation starter that he had been projected to be in the past.
And we're talking there about Gordon Graceffo. Number 13, Chen-Wei Lin, who was in his first full professional season. He had a brief introduction in 2023, but his first year pitched all the time, the whole season at Palm Beach. Continued to improve as the season went on to the point he was the Florida State Pitcher of the Month in August, our Pitcher of the Month as well, as we felt, as well as the Cardinals organization. Pitched very strongly in the playoffs as well. Chen-Wei Lin, of course, the first Cardinals player ever from Taiwan. Very tall, 6'7", lanky guy, can throw the ball hard, but he's still, like a lot of young guys, working on his secondary pitches.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a little bit of an Ian Bedell thing going on with him too, in the sense of, he gets a fastball with a lot of tailing action, gets a changeup with a lot of tailing action, and his slider's really just inconsistent, doesn't get a ton of glove side break with it. Oftentimes it actually falls into the arm side break category. So definitely gonna have to develop that third pitch. But I mean, anytime you have a guy sitting 96, 97, working up to 101 as young as he is, with still a good amount of maturity to come, it looks like on his frame. He's a tall guy, but he's kind of lanky and wiry. So you think as he adds strength, there's the potential for that fastball to keep ticking up even more, which would just make it an absolutely dynamite pitch. So a ton of potential with him, and I think a ton more bat missing potential that he has yet to show.
Yep. And so Chen-Wei Lin's a guy that we're definitely going to keep an eye on. He was kept at the same level for all last season because it was his first year as a professional. But he's a guy that has a potential to move ahead pretty quickly if he gets it figured out.
Agreed.
Another competitor for the Memphis rotation in 2025, and this is a common thread in the players we're going to talk about today, Sem Robberse. And Robberse, started off last year with Memphis, looked like he was going to be the guy to call up to St. Louis when they needed another starter. Unfortunately, suffered an injury that slowed him down, and we didn't see him back with the major leagues, but he should be in the mix here in 2025 and is still young at 23.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, he's had issues in the past with his fastball getting hit hard and just some other things. And he's really a really smart pitcher. He's a tinkerer. He knows what he needs to do to have success. And he loves to kind of toy with his pitch usage, his pitch shapes, and all of that to have success. So he's really made his fastball a much more effective pitch. It still can struggle a little bit against same-sided hitters, actually. So I'd be curious to see if he can add a sinker to overcome that. But he's dropped the fastball usage, really leaned on that dynamite sweeper and changeup that he has. So he's a guy with a lot of potential just to keep kind of tinkering his way into success at the major league level. So very excited to see if he can make that happen this year.
So we're watching Sem Robberse to see what he looks like from the spring course from the Netherlands. So a lot of international flavor here in the Cardinals pitching ranks here in the 10 to 15 range. Coming in at number 11 is a guy who technically probably shouldn't be considered a prospect because Victor Scott had 145 major league at bats and 83 days of service time. But I think everybody who watched Victor Scott realized that he was rushed to the major leagues. If folks remember, this wasn't just the Cardinals being a knee-jerk organization here. They basically, all three of the guys who they had who could play center field were on the injured list to start the year. And so almost by default, it was either going to be Victor Scott or Michael Ciani, who was just taken off the waiver wire. Scott went back to Memphis and worked hard and was able to come back up again late in the year, but didn't have the kind of season at either level that everyone thought he would have. What's next for Victor Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think he made some legitimate progress last year, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think a lot of us thought that, he's just so fast that he's just automatically going to be a plus defender, and that really just wasn't the case for him. He didn't take great reads a lot of times. Kind of looked like he second guessed himself a little bit, and that really just limited the balls that he was able to get to. His defense didn't actually play as well as it could have at the beginning of the year, and I think he showed a ton of improvement with reading the ball and taking good routes to it, especially when we saw him come back up to the majors later in the year. So I think his defense is certainly trending the right way. He's still a guy with that Gold Glove potential, ton of speed. I think really for him, it's just continue developing defensively and just he doesn't even necessarily have to be a good hitter. He just has to make himself appear to be somewhat of a threat. I think pitchers just pound the zone against him because they know he's not going to do anything. So it's really tough for him to draw walks when they're just staying in the zone with every pitch that they throw to him. So, I think he really struggled against breaking balls. He doesn't have a ton of power. And I think one of the ways that he was able to minimize his struggles against lefties was by bunting against them. And we really saw that take a step back this year. So I think if he can just start getting those bunts down against lefties and just really learn how to slap balls into the gap and use that speed to get doubles, it's just going to make pitchers want to stay out of the zone a little bit more against him, which then means he's getting on base more, and then he can really use that speed on the bases. So he doesn't have to be a good hitter. He just has to be a serviceable hitter. So we'll see if he can get himself there.
Another outfielder we have at number 10, and folks can read much more details about Chase Davis in the free article that we have at number 10. But just very briefly, of course, Davis was a first rounder in 2023, played with Palm Beach last year, didn't really do well, but it's the first partial season after the draft. Went back to Palm Beach, had a relatively quiet April, really struggled in May, but then he completely flipped the script and had an OPS of 1147 in June, Florida State League Player of the Month, System-Wide Player of the Month, Davis really had a June where everybody said, okay, this is a guy the Cardinals drafted the first round. Then he slowed down in July. They didn't promote him to Peoria. But then at the end of July, when all the new players came in from this draft, they moved him up. He spent 1 month at Peoria, did well there in high A. And surprisingly, the Cardinals moved Chase Davis to double A to finish the season, where he spent the last 8 or 10 games there, I think, including the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really successful season for him, especially after how poorly it started. He really started to heat up, and we saw him really messing with his swing. He kind of messed around with something in spring training and then went back to his old swing to start the year, and then went back to what he did in spring training, and then kind of dialed that in a little bit more as the season went on. So definitely doing some tinkering with the swing. I think likely to try to see the ball better and really improve the hit tool, because he's a guy with immense power. He just hasn't really been able to tap into it because he really struggles to hit the ball cleanly and squarely sometimes. And that, a lot of the times you'd see him get a fastball down the middle, like he should hit this 500 feet, and he just like slightly mishits it, and it dives like 360 feet down the line, and then gets caught. So I think if we can see him just start to like barrel the ball a little bit better, he's really going to tap into that power that he has, because he's already showing good production. It's just he's a guy who really could hit the ball a lot more effectively even than he did this year. So hopefully there's more there, and a lot of that's just going to come with hit tool improvements, which hopefully can come by him really finding the consistent swing that works for him.
All right, so that's Chase Davis. Now at number 9, this is probably one of the players that you and I have the biggest disagreement about, who, in our top 20. And I'm talking about Michael McGreevy, who everybody knows is a command specialist, who doesn't, issue a lot of walks, has a lot of offerings, doesn't necessarily have the blow away fastball, but had a lot of struggles against left-handed pitching. And it seems like he made significant improvement in that area during the year. And of course, got a chance to work with St. Louis a couple different times and did pretty well. And seems like he might be penciled into the back end of the rotation. But you're not yet sold on McGreevy being a top 10 prospect in the system. Why is that?
Not quite yet, and it's because of his issues against lefties. So we look at the sinker, it gets a 70% ground ball rate. It's not the most explosive sinker, but if you can keep the ball on the ground, it's effective. But the problem is lefties hit it a little bit better, and so he really tries to mix in like four seamers and cutters and curveballs and changeups against lefties. The problem is that just none of those pitches have really, one, grayed out particularly well as pitches, and two, none of them have really been that effective against lefties. He just doesn't really quite have that go-to offer, or even the combination of offerings that can really limit lefties. So even this year, when we saw him in AAA, 605 OPS against righties, and if I can find it here, a 771 OPS against lefties. And I do think we saw some improvements in the major leagues. I'm worried about the sample size issues there, and I do think over a larger sample, we're going to see some of those same issues that he's carried with him. So I'm not necessarily out on McGreevy as a starter. I truly hope he gets a lot of run in the rotation and gets the chance to prove that he can be that backhand guy, because he can work deep into games consistently. He pounds the zone. He can get ground balls. He does a lot of things you would want to see a backhand starter do. I still just have some concerns about how he's going to perform against left-handed hitters specifically, that I don't think he is fully addressed enough for me to put him into my top 10.
And I think we're going to get that chance probably. I mean, we don't know what the rotation is going to be, but even right now, he kind of looks like the number 5. And, at this point, obviously, Lynn and Gibson are gone. We don't know if Matz is going to be gone. I mean, there's a possibility that Fetty, could get traded as well. So, if the Cardinals go really young, I think McGreevy's on the top of the list of young starters to try right now.
Yeah, I agree. And he definitely deserves to be. I mean, his track record at AAA shows that he's a guy who looks like he could take that role. He's spent a lot of time there. He's made legitimate improvements. So I don't think he's a finished product by any means. So hopefully he really works this offseason to find some sort of a lefty neutralizing offer, and comes into camp and really wins that starting job and takes off a little bit.
And a healthy, durable guy. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's pitching 150 innings, every year since he's been a pro, no time on the injured list. That's the kind of guy, you want, even if he's a back end rotation guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's a huge selling point for him.
All right, so number 8, catcher Leonardo Bernal. There's been so much talk about, of course, Herrera and Pages and Jimmy Crooks, the player of the year in the system, who will be coming up in our countdown later. But our number 8 prospect is a guy who's hit more than 10% above league average at every level when he's young for his level every year. And he's going to be age 20, Leonardo Bernal, switch hitter, 21 years old at AA. And this guy is 6 feet, 245 pounds, and is a pretty good two-way player.
Yeah, he's a guy with just like really solid all-around tools. He doesn't have one elite tool that really stands out, but these guys continue to develop. He's hit really well at every level. We've seen his arm really improve. I mean, I think last year he threw out like 21% of base stealers and or I guess in 2023 he threw out 21% of base stealers, and then this past season he threw out 34%. So that's a big improvement. And it's certainly something that we have seen Ivan Herrera struggle with at the major league level. And you want to see a catcher be able to do that. And that's something that could really allow Bernal to stick in something of an everyday role. He's already been a really solid defensive catcher. He's a switch hitter. His swing looks kind of feels a little bit better from the left side than the right side, and that's obviously good for him as he's going to face more right-handed pitchers than left-handed pitchers over the course of his career. So already good there. And I mean, he's a guy who hit a ball like over 110 miles per hour with a wood bat as an 18-year-old. So there's certainly some power projection in there as well. Even if he hasn't fully manifested yet, it's important to keep in mind that he's still a super young prospect. For as long as he's been in the system and for as much success as he's had, he's still a guy who's extremely young and has already shown tremendous growth.
Yep. So that's Leonardo Bernal. Look for him likely to be the regular catcher at Double A Springfield this coming year. Last player we're going to cover tonight, and we're running a little long, but hopefully you're enjoying this and more detail about all these players, of course, at the Cardinal Nation. Number 7, starting pitcher Cooper Hjerpe, left-hander, who was taken the first round in 2022. You really like Cooper stuff. I do too. But, he only threw 52 innings this year, coming off about the same number of innings the prior year. And the big question about Cooper Hjerpe is his elbow going to hold up?
Yeah, I mean, I think nobody really was really going to question this stuff. The guy misses bats every time he steps on the mound. I mean, he's putting up strikeout rates like near 35% with ease. It's just a question of can he stay healthy? And I think that's a question we've seen with a lot of pitchers, specifically in the Cardinal system. But I think it's a question too, just with pitchers generally across baseball, especially ones with the electric stuff or the low arm slots or whatever it is. It's just a symptom of pitching. So I think to a certain element, when evaluating these guys, you have to look at the ceiling and realize that they might not hit the ceiling. If they do, it's super high. I think Cooper Hjerpe has a case to be potentially the highest ceiling pitcher in the organization. Has some of the best stuff in the organization. You could argue that it is the best stuff in the organization. It's just, a lot of issues with the elbow, hasn't been on the mound that much. The Cardinals haven't really let him work, especially deep into games yet. So he's going to have a similar issue there that we've seen with Tink Hence. So obviously still some red flags, some concerns with Hjerpe, but I mean the potential here is through the roof if he can actually stay on the mound.
It'll be interesting to see at what point, after 2 years of injuries, both for Hjerpe and Tink Hence, at what point will the Cardinals say, hey, maybe you can stay healthier if you work in relief rather than start? Because, these guys are this good, but yet they're still stuck in Double A because their injuries haven't allowed them to progress as fast as they like. And of course, Hence, was a high school guy. So the fact that he's been in the system 2 years longer, Hjerpe, of course, was a very successful college pitcher at Oregon State.
Yeah, and I think that's a path the Cardinals might eventually go down, and I think that's why, it's easy to be as bullish on these guys as we are, because even if they don't work out as starters, they look like back end bullpen guys, like guys who can come in to be closers and maybe those high octane strikeout arms. So there's certainly a viable path to being a major contributor at the highest level. I just hope the Cardinals give them as long of a leash as possible to continue starting, because that is where they can provide the most value. And they have some of the highest potential of any starting pitching prospect in the system. So you obviously want even one of those guys to hit, or as many of those guys to hit as you can possibly get. But obviously, if their arms can't hold up, you got to put them in a role that's going to make them useful.
Now, in the old organization model, that would have definitely been the answer. The Cardinals would have kept these guys starting until the last moment. And the example I always use is Trevor Rosenthal, who was, of course, a very successful closer for a long time. Trevor Rosenthal was a reliever in 0 games in the minor leagues. He became a reliever only when he came up. He started with Memphis until the very end. But with new guys in charge, we'll have to see how the organization handles some of these guys who have tremendous talent but haven't been able to progress as quickly as anybody would like because of injuries.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why this next season specifically is going to be huge, because it's obviously the last season under John Mozeliak. And, if we see another year of injuries we can throw Roby into this group too, with Hence and Hjerpe and Roby and all of these guys. You have to wonder how a new kind of brain trust at the top is going to handle these guys, if they're going to keep sticking with them as starters, or if they're going to say, they only have so many bullets in their arm because they're getting hurt so much. Let's use those at the major league level and get them up there. So
that's right, Blake, that, the theme of going young depends on how young they want to go, right?
That's true. I mean, again, like I think some of these guys like Tink Hent specifically, I think, is a major league pitcher already. He could pitch out of a bullpen. He's in the minors to try to work up the arm strength on his arm. Cooper Hjerpe, you can make a similar case for him. So be very interesting to see how the Cardinals organization handles them.
That's right. And how they deal with all these guys who are candidates to start at Memphis. They have many more candidates. I can go up to 9 potential
Yeah.
starting candidates at Memphis for 5 jobs. So, we'll see how this all shakes out. Again, the trading isn't even done yet. But there could be even more new guys coming in the mix for all we know.
Yeah, it's going to start narrowing here, especially as these guys get closer to the majors.
Yep. Yep. So with that, we will close our Christmas edition of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry. Again, you can read more about all these prospects as we continue our Cardinal Nation Top 50 Prospect Countdown. And we want to thank everyone for listening to us throughout the course of the year, and hope you all and your families have a Merry Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening. Merry Christmas and enjoy that time with your family.